You absolutely will need to dissect corpses. The mere fact that I'm showing you this stuff is really rare. I never show my studies. Look at this composition. My goodness, this is a power stance. Screw this guy. He's too good. He's too good. My dudes, welcome back to Trent's Artist Study series. Today we're taking a look at Brom, who is a very established oil painter. Now, if you like gothic dark fantasy paintings from the 90s, you're definitely already very familiar with Brom's work. I met him in person while working on Diablo 3. The entire Diablo 3 art team was very much trying to emulate a lot of what Brom did in his oil paintings. That was what we tried to accomplish as an oil-painted dark fantasy game with Diablo 3. I myself sat down to do many studies of this guy's work during that period of time in like 2008, 2009, and I will show you my studies, and basically that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about how he does his compositions, how he does his texturing and materials. He does a very interesting blend, by the way, of acrylics and oil paints to get this very controlled lighting in his pieces, and I'll explain that a little bit more. This isn't to copy entirely Brom's work. This isn't to perfectly emulate him exactly, but we're hoping to pick up a couple of nuggets, something that we could maybe apply to our own work. Doing these studies transformed my artwork, and I became capable of doing things that I was never capable of doing, especially because I come from a comic book background where everything's very like black and white, literally. Like you might have a gray tone in there, but for the most part, you're using black ink. Whereas Brom, he does a very, very textured kind of an approach, and I'll explain a lot of that as we go. Without any further hesitation, let's dig into the art of Brom. I thought it would be good to start out with this one because it's very much, very distinctly Brom style. And in some cases, I think the guy just kind of like has a great like anatomy study and builds his piece around that. Like we're looking at these incredible neck muscles here, and you can't do this without studying your anatomy. You absolutely will need to dissect corpses. Now, there's definitely some strong understanding of musculature and anatomy going on here. And you'll notice this very strong, like, gradient from across the image. Like, it never gets, when I'm talking about gradient, I'm saying it gets brightest right here where we want the viewer to look, right? Brom has he's very cognizant of this in every piece. This is another one. Check this out. The light is always going to where he wants you to look. And this is that effect that I was describing when I was saying he starts out with acrylics because you get the very fast acrylic work down, but then by using a little bit of oil, he can darken in these values so that the values, the light and dark, never get as bright as it gets right here. Down here, when it's not in the focal point, it's never brighter than that. And so what that does is it makes the viewer immediately look at her and her arm and her face. And then also, by the way, here on this, the lyre that he has here, it's important that the background behind it is darker, like very dark. In fact, when we look at the values, look at that. It's almost black. But then the contrast of that on the lyre in the foreground is this very, very, very much more bright in values. It's standing out because of that. This is very not dissimilar from the studies we did with Mike Mignola a couple of episodes ago, right? If you're not sure if your values are reading very clearly, it's a good idea for you to increase the contrast and then switch your image to black and white and see like how much of the focal point of the upper body, usually the chest or the face of the character that you're painting, how much of your subject is in light versus how much is in shadow. Specifically here, you'll notice that the light is very much coming in from kind of the camera angle. I would say like from where the camera is. In fact, I'm a little bit surprised he didn't do like a darker background behind the head of this character. But then you've got this slow gradation where it doesn't quite, as I said, just like with the other piece, it never quite gets as bright here as it does here or up, especially towards the face and the brightest part of the face. And so what you can do, like I do this a lot where I'll have a selection because I work digitally mostly, but lately I've been scanning in a lot of my inked line work. But you can do this digitally, and he does this with oil paint or possibly even airbrush. I suspect that Brom uses a little bit of airbrush, and I should ask him actually. But what you can do is like select the lower body, and especially this is especially nice if you have your character already cut out. like if you've done your color flats, this is an easy thing to do. You just select it real quick and then hit it with an airbrush, like just a little bit of black. And like after you've done all of your rendering of your musculature, you can just go in and kind of like darken it out. And you see how that just immediately pulls the eye a lot closer to the face, right? And he does this a lot. He's doing it with acrylics and oils, and acrylics, you can't do that so much. With oils, though, however, on top of acrylics, you absolutely can. And that's the beautiful thing about that mixed medium kind of a thing. There's another thing, by the way, that he does is like, if you have, and this is why it's important to do all those boring studies of like lighting spheres, right? Like I've got in my easy art lessons, I talk a lot about, like how to light spheres in the first few episodes, because it's so essential to be able to do stuff like this, like paintings like this, because are only possible if you do those kind of studies of light, like how to light a sphere, because you need to be able to cut out and sharpen the underlight of a shoulder muscle. Look at how that pops, right? And so in a lot of cases, like when you look at Sakimi-chan, and this isn't exclusive to dark fantasy art. This is a tool that every great painter needs to know how to do. And in fact, if you're doing comic book stuff, not all that dissimilar from doing hatching. Like comic book artists will do this kind of thing where I'm going to grab a pencil. Like if you look at Pitt or the Incredible Hulk from the 1990s, not all that dissimilar. Like if I were to, let's just say for the sake of argument, like if I were a comic book artist and I were inking this, I'd do something like this. And then what those guys would do is these like hatching, and then kind of like for each of the muscles, you kind of do another hatch like this. And I want to do some dissectional of like Jim Lee and, some of these comic book artists. Will Sportasio was like, he did that a lot, but this definition of the underside and the fading up, you're almost kind of like tracing out the contours. And I would venture to say that when Brom is doing his pencil sketches, he's very likely doing this kind of like a fade up, either that or maybe even taking like the side of the pencil and doing a little bit of chiaroscuro, which is like that kind of like gradient of blending the light up. But Brom, he's painting it in. And this is kind of an interesting thing that I learned, one of my big takeaways, and I wish I had higher resolution images here. But one of my big takeaways when I was doing my studies is this like highlight underneath the muscle. This is where the light is kind of getting into the cracks. Like, so let's say that we're looking at this muscle right here from the side view. You'd be looking at this, right? And this is the shoulder, right? So if our eye is here and we're looking at this muscle, we'd see this part's all in shadow, right? But then this part right here would get like let me green it up. That part right there would get this highlight. That's what you're looking at right there. Boom. And that pops out the contrast of that shadow, that underside. That's this shadow I'm talking about here. It pops it out because you've got this contrast of light underneath. Now check this out. You might be looking at this and going, dude, Trent, how did you get some original Brom rough sketches? Well, here's the thing, bros. This ain't Brom. This is me. This is my studies. I did these studies back when I was working on Diablo 3. This is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about doing studies. Now, this is my version of a study this is the original Brom. Now, I came from a comic book background, so all of this gradient of values was kind of a really a new thing for me at that time. Even though I had shipped several games, I'd worked on World of Warcraft, I had shipped several games as a concept artist. Mostly, I had come from being a comic book penciler at Marvel Comics and an indie comics guy. So this was like a whole different way of thinking for me to do these kind of studies, and it transformed my work entirely to do this. And so your goal is not to create this. Your goal is to understand this. But even now, as I look at this, I realize like there's so many things that I could have done better. For instance, like, there's a lot more light going on in the shadow areas here. So even this, I would say like image, adjustments, replace color, and then go into here and then lighten that up even a little bit more because it gets a little too dark, I think. And then also, he has a lot of texturing on his work that you get when you're doing oils and acrylics. You get that texture from simply the paper, really, and the brushes. So if we're working digitally and we want to get some texture in our work like that, you can go down and like I've got tons of texture brushes. I would do this on another layer so that you can like back it off. This is super cheap and easy way to do this. By the way, this is not all that dissimilar from the way like Wing Wei works or some of these artists that are really highly detailed painters. They'll do a lot of layers with this texturing. This is one way to get a little bit of that texturing. And then you want to like highlight the underside of some of these muscles. And then also you've got this inside of the, again, I'm using a more textured brush here, but inside of the shoulder muscle there. He's also got like some splotches kind of like through here on this troll dude's. I guess he's like a giant. But he's got some like splotches and imperfections in the skin, kind of showing that he's weathered and worn. And so like you can really get lost in the texturing and material of these things. But that's the fun, that's the joy of painting that people don't, I don't know that most people understand, because a lot of times you can associate a lot of pain with it when you're not getting it down. But once you start to get it down, it's like, man, that is the joy of painting. And then also I noticed another thing that Brom does is these tiny little highlights. Like check this out on this belt. It's just like, this is such a subtle thing. And I remember distinctly seeing this and going, wow, it's just like, it's not a full streak like that. It's not a full thing. It's just a little dab thing, little dab, rendering out the metals and then like blending and fading those metals into a texture, a really strong texture. Like another way to get that texture, by the way, is to use the mixer brush. So if you go down in Photoshop, there's a thing called the mixer brush tool, and you got to have something that's very grainy in order to pull this off. And what you'll notice is this, look, check it out. Like, look at that texture. I'm going to zoom in a lot on this, but look at how that just breaks apart. What it's doing is like, if this were just a regular brush, and let's say that I were using some like bright color, what you would see is this texture, right? That's the texture you're getting. That's a regular brush. But by switching that to the mixer brush, it's taking the color that's underneath it and it's blending that texture of the brush into the colors that are underneath it, right? And so that's how you're getting this like much stronger texture blend going on. So like the mixer brush is something that just came along in the last few years. They didn't even have that when I was doing my original studies. But man, yeah, like if I had that, oh boy. You can color dab to load your mixer brush a little bit, and it's sort of like an oil brush. And I already know that like some goof off in the comments is going to go, your studies don't look like Brom, but don't be a fool, okay? Like I learned a lot from doing this, and I think that if you sit down, if like say that you were a comic book artist or you're somebody who just doesn't paint like this at all, or you're just trying to learn and understand how do these guys even do it, just pick one little piece like this. Like just pick this dude's face and try to do like a one-to-one study of just that face. Your goal is not to impress anybody. Your goal is not to have an end product with this. In fact, the mere fact that I'm showing you this stuff is really rare. I never show my studies because it's like people think, oh, you're just trying to copy. Yeah. That's the point, is to understand and dissect their process of how they did things. So here's another example of another study that I did and some other takeaways that you could get out of this, by the way. So this is that face. This is me doing a study of this face because I do not paint like that. And I think I even used Corel Painter for a lot of this texture work at the time because it was the closest thing to oil paints that you could get at the time. And something that I pulled away from this, a really big takeaway, is this. Secondary and tertiary colors blended into the core shadow, which is basically right where the light turns. And I'm like, you could get away with putting a little bit of this orange into here and here as well, by the way. But where it's going to be the hottest, right where the light is hitting it. Another way to get this effect, by the way, and this is a bit of a cheap way, but you'll see a lot of artists on YouTube do this. I won't pick on them, but there are a lot of guys that do this party trick where they'll grab something like hot red, and then they'll go in and create a new layer and set that to color dodge. and then hit that with that, and you'll get that bright saturated glow. And that almost creates a little bit of the core shadow glow, which is where the light is bouncing into the shadows. Now, there's a lot of things wrong with my study here. Proportionally, it's a pretty poor study, but at the same time, the education that I got out of this was stellar. This is the benefit of doing digital, by the way, is I can go in and use Liquify and go, I can make that nose a little bigger or move the mouth, get a little bit closer to the actual proportions of a human being there. My inclination is to do something like this, and maybe the sketch can be that, right? However, what I learned from doing this piece was, and this is not dissimilar from Yoji Shinkawa as well, instead of doing the line art, draw in the shadow, paint in the shadow of that whole thing, and then cut out around that, for instance, and don't be so worried about is that the right line or is it the wrong line or because what you're going to be doing is cutting away and then adding to. And so the buildup method that most oil painters will do is this: paint in the darkest value. So in this case, the darkest value of his skin is this shadow color right here, and kind of block it and cluster it the same way that when we were doing our Mike Mignola studies and or Yoji Shinkawa studies, in the same way that you're sort of clustering your shadows together, especially if you watch my extended editions of those videos over on my Gumroad channel, you'll know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about clustering your shadows so that your highlighted areas pop out a lot more. And then what you do in the buildup method that painters do is then they go in and they paint in with their highlight color or their midtones. This is where the cheek kind of sits like that. And this part sticks out a little bit. This is, again, look at what he's doing with the bottom lip here. The bicep connecting to the shoulder that we were doing in the first image that we dissected. Same thing is happening right here. This is the build-up technique. We're painting like a sculptor. And here's a quick look at a couple of other studies that I did. This is not looking at anything. Here you can kind of see how I was just color dabbing from the source material to see, oh, wait a minute, there's a little bit of purple in there. Where does that purple come from, by the way? That's what you call a tertiary color. But just generally speaking, a complementary color is directly across the color wheel. A tertiary color creates a triangle across the wheel, roughly. But technically speaking, if your values are correct, it doesn't matter what colors you're using at all. How's that for an oversimplification of color theory? One of my favorite things is seeing Brom paint one of my character designs. The Demon Hunter was my character design, and I had done the first sketches of the character and evolved her design a lot throughout that process. And there were multiple artists that got involved with it. But when you see Brom do this final painting of your character design, that's super rewarding and super cool. He did add his own flavoring to it and his own styling to it. And there's a lot of details that weren't in the original design, but it just works so incredibly well. So that was super satisfying and super rewarding. Look at the composition on this bad boy. Wow. This is so cool. The silhouette of the character, so incredibly focused. First of all, she has a really strong silhouette. This is not dissimilar from what we saw when we were looking at our Mike Mignola stuff, right? And Mike Mignola is a super simplified version of these kind of gothic dark imagery as well. Because with this, you also have the gradient, and this is that thing I was talking about, even though we have her silhouetted, with this high contrast background, very simple background too, by the way. You see this gradient where nothing down here, even at its brightest point, look at the value scale, nowhere near the brightest point on the upper body. That's because there's literally a gradient going up that. And that's very likely applied with oil paints. We could just do it with that airbrush like I showed you. But that's really cool. The only spot where we're seeing red is on her head, right? So we have color contrast as well, pulling your eye directly to the point where there's the most color contrast. And why red is important is because the whole piece is greenish blue, mostly blue. Actually, the whole piece is blue. But then you have this really warm spot right on her head. Wow. And a little bit of blue. This is such a subtlety, but it's so beautiful. This is another trick that you could do, by the way. So let's say you've got her completely selected and she's on her own layer, right? Go down to create a gradient map. We want to choose something that's got a blue to it. That's too blue. So we desaturate that a little bit, maybe even bring it a little closer to the greens, Yeah, there we go. And then a little bit more of this green, a little more blue, a little more blue. So with the gradient map, it takes the values that are underneath and it applies the gradient scale across that. And I've done several tutorials about this, but you can go into the mask and you can erase out. And so you remember how I was showing you how you should create like a value gradient. You can also create a color gradient. And look at that. Like that pulls your eye to that spot too. And then if you cut out, obviously, like cut out that red, you get that stark color contrast. Brom definitely gravitates more towards value contrast and color contrast for the most part to create, and he does that with detail contrast as well. His pieces are very busy, but they never seem busy because the busyness is contained into an area where he wants you to look. Conan by Brom, really cool piece. Another perfect example of like, you see how the silhouette stands out from a background that's mostly light. Again, you know, we talked about this with other compositional techniques that some of the other artists I've covered in this series do. He also, incredible use of blending of secondary and tertiary colors into the metals. He's a master at painting iron and metal and things like that. Some artists will go in here and they'll like, you know, render out tons of detail in the hair and things like that. But Brom don't do that. No, no, no. He wants to make sure that, you know, he's utilizing his clusters of shadows very cleverly, and his light's very consistent throughout this whole piece as well. These great fantasy painters of the 80s and 90s, they really, really utilized their, there's a little bit of Bisley in here too, I can tell. Or whoever influenced Bisley, I think also influenced Brom, because you definitely get like these veiny muscles. Like this is, sometimes I think these painters back then would just do a painting like this just as an excuse to paint cool muscles on bulky, muscular, you know, warriors. I love this piece though, you know, really, really, really cool framing, really cool light. And then also, you know, interesting choice to almost make it look like the sail from the ship is torn in the background. It feels worn down and rugged. And by the way, this is an interesting choice too, that there's this, all this texture work going on to create this little bit of underlighting down here. And also flames behind his legs, but notice they don't get too saturated, because these, if they were too saturated, they would pull the viewer's eye down here. And that's not what we want to see. We want to see the viewer's eye go up here. This is what we want to see. This is what everybody wants to see. Brom does these really nice pieces. His characters are always super slender, by the way. I don't know what that is. It's like, maybe it's a goth thing. But like it's got so much of a strong silhouette on the character. And again, you know, this kind of harkens back to the very first image that we looked at, where we just have this really strong silhouette. I'm surprised that he went as highlighted on this hand. Usually he fades that out so that your eye goes up to the face a little bit more. Also considering this arm is in the background, I'm just actually a little bit surprised he didn't like keep that like darkened in a little bit back here so that it's just less prominent than this hand and the face. And, you know, maybe every artist looks at the paintings they do and go, oh yeah, there was one more thing I wanted to add, but like I didn't get to that part. I don't know if he feels that way. I don't want to project that, but what's interesting here is that he also did this thing where, you see, that's not like perfectly black. He didn't go to solid black on the backside of his face. In fact, what that is actually the light from the background bouncing a little bit into the shadow part of his face. Like if this background color were something else that were a little bit blue, then he'd have a little bit of blue in that shadow right here. And in fact, I wonder if I can illustrate that by saying like, go to image, replace color, and we'll just replace all this mustard color. Your bounced light is always got to be consistent. So if you have a character that's up against a bright green background and they have a lot of shadows on them, that's going to affect how much light gets into that. They call it the fill light, but it basically, it's the light that bounces into the shadows of your silhouetted characters. Very powerful technique. I picked this piece because look at this composition. My goodness, this is a power stance. And by the way, this is a pose that you see athletes do after they've like won a championship or something. This is a victorious pose, right? This is summoning the undead or something. This is celebrating some crazy shit. Like she's going all out. And first of all, she's got the stuff and she knows how to use it, you know? And Brom, he knows how to paint it. He doesn't do super anime proportions, although sometimes he does draw his women a little bit like on the anorexic side. And I'm a little bit surprised that this one isn't more of that, but the silhouetting of it is just so incredibly powerful. And I believe this piece is cut off because normally artists don't want to do This is what you'd call a tangent, where the subject matter gets a little too close to the frame. You don't want to do that. If you have like a character with huge wings like this, you would want to go like way out to just make sure that they don't conflict, or just cut it short so that it doesn't touch the edges of the frame of the image. Like that actually just has like a better compositional flow to it. But man, this one's really cool and also very monochromatic. And by the way, when it comes to Brom's work, I noticed, especially in evaluating this in this study, almost monochromatic a lot of times. You know, he's really actually sticking with a flavor for every piece. He kind of picks like 2 or 3 main colors, and then he's got little tertiary and secondary colors that blend off of that into the shadows. But for the most part, very, very like monochromatic. But I love this piece because it also has like, look at this texture work. Like, this is why I could never paint in one art style, because I look at this and I go, man, I don't want to do like, you know, super cartoony line art stuff. I want to do super raw, realistic, textured oil and acrylic paintings. Like, oh man, hell yeah. If you want to accomplish a much more like realistic painterly style like this, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you do studies, but do them entirely in black and white first, because it's too much. It's too much information for you to try to like manage colors, color theory, secondary, tertiary, complementary color theories, and the texture work, and the lighting information, and the compositional stuff. Like, you really need to just focus on, how do I get that texture there? How do I get this like light booming out this edge of this surface, the core shadow here? How do I get that definition of the belly button and the anatomy and under the breast like this? Like, just focus on the values first. And then what you could do is go in and add, like, say, a gradient map. And like, boom, your piece is almost done. It's like, if your values are there and your textures and your contrast and your composition, if all those other things are working, your colors aren't going to be that important. In fact, you'll start to figure that out along the way. But try to focus on just like one thing at a time. All right, dudes, last one. Every time I say, I think this is my last one, I pull up another image and I'm like, oh, that one, I got to do that one. So again, we see the value and color contrast. See how the lighting is doing this gradient up from below. This is that outfit that I was talking about. Remember, kind of really gothic, very slender. Notice that her leg is entirely in shadow. This piece just embodies everything that I've been talking about throughout this whole video. Floodlight, fill light, right? Look at that. This kind of color right here is in all of the shadows. It's even in the dark black of this robe that she's wearing. You've got the power of symmetry, which I talked about in the previous video. Like, wow. Okay. And then you've also got, check this out, values. The values on the background never get quite as dark as the values that we see on the foreground. They're dark, but they're saturated. They have like a color to them. And that color is like a warm color, right? So we've got this warm color in the background. She's all in cool colors. Boom! That is that color contrast. That's the value contrast. The only thing that's missing here is that it ain't blurry back there, right? Like this would kind of work a little bit more almost if it was like a little bit blurrier back there. And in a lot of ways, that's why it gets silhouetted, right? It's almost just a gradient back here. These things with just a little bit of callouts of like, oh yeah, you can kind of see a little bit of armor, but like, we're not meant to know who this is. It's just a knight or a soldier that maybe she killed, was performing some kind of ceremony with their bodies. Oh my gosh, look at this, the silhouettes. Oh man, screw this guy. He's too good. He's too good. Like the silhouette of what's going on back here that sets those are little crows sitting on the cross thing and the swords. Like this whole scene just sets up a story, and it sets up like a mood and an atmosphere and like all this like armor laying around. There's another thing, and I didn't even mention this, and I regret that I didn't mention it until now. Brom's paintings all have story. Even when he's painting somebody else's character that's already got their story, he adds to that story. I think that's really important. I think that's something every artist should aspire to do, especially if you're an illustrator. If you're a concept artist, you can't be a concept artist without being a storyteller, because character design is all storytelling. That's all it is. Well, it's not all it is. There's other rules to it too. But try to tell a story with your paintings. The fact that there's like, empty helmets laying on the ground around them, the fact that there are these dead soldiers hanging from the tree behind her with their swords in the ground, This tells a story. This says there was a battle here and she's performing some ceremony. She's got this little thing down here, like that looks like some kind of an offering or something. I don't know, or maybe they had come here. Is that a dead bat? Like a dead bat laying on the ground. It's like she just came in with like a poison mist. I'm thinking I think that's what the story here is. She like summoned a poison mist that killed all these dudes. Fuck. This makes me want to be like a fantasy painter for D&D or something. I've never gotten to do anything for D&D or Magic the Gathering, but man, like this makes me want to try. Like I think I could do it too. I'll just switch up from my comic book style and paint like Brom. Give me 2 days, I'll do a couple more studies. I could paint like Brom. Anyway, that's it for this video. I want to thank you guys so much for stopping by. If you're interested in more of these artist studies, or there's a particular artist that you'd like to see me break down and study, please do drop that in the comments below. I'd love to know, what's your biggest takeaway from studying Brom from this video? I'd love to hear your comments below. Obviously, I teach courses like more hand-holdy, real-time process videos over on my Gumroad channel. I want to encourage you to check those out. If you're brand new to digital art, check out my free digital artist starter kit over on my Gumroad channel as well, or pick up my brushes over there. I just released a new art book. This is the World of Twilight Monk Volume 2. It's got a lot of designs and much more detail and much more of my fully fleshed out painterly kind of a style for the World of Twilight Monk. Twilight Monk was a series of novels that I've been writing, and it was recently translated into a video game on Nintendo Switch and on PC. The link is in the description below the video. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and I will see you in the next video. All right, ciao.